So now that I've explained the basics of what Piaget's theory of cognitive development is all about, let's proceed to look at what he actually said regarding how cognitive development proceeds. He said that human beings develop, cognitively speaking, in stages based on age as they get older. Now, this is important because not everybody views cognitive development as occurring in a series of somewhat specific stages. Before I even get to the stages, keep in mind that these are not absolute and exact regarding age. Age provides a general parameter. So, for example, the first stage he identifies, the sensory motor stage, occurs from birth to age 2. But that's an approximation regarding age. If a child does not think in exactly the way Piaget said they should be thinking the day after their second birthday, that's not cause for alarm. The second stage is preoperational from about age 2 to 7. Now, even though our focus in this course is on adolescence, I'm going to very briefly talk about the three stages preceding that, so you can kind of see the lead up. So, as I said, the sensory motor stage is from birth to about age 2. And in this stage, cognitively speaking, a child learns how to coordinate their senses, the activities of their senses with motor activities. And I know in everyday life we don't think of it that way, but if you sat and watched a child in this period, you can almost visually see that's exactly what they're doing with their head. And the text provides a pretty simple example of this, that you have a baby that's watching something with their eyes, and then they have to coordinate their visual identification of the object with their hand reaching to grab it. And when explained in such a simple manner, we think, well, yeah, of course it requires being able to coordinate those things together. And you can see coordination developing and getting better with babies. But we tend not to recognize that's what's going on when we see it occurring. Preoperational is about age 2 to 7. And that's when a kid really starts to represent their world symbolically, which is not as far out as it sounds, because language is a symbol. So, learning to represent the world symbolically means, at least in part, learning language, and on a deeper level, how to use language to represent something. So, when they say the word dog, they know that word represents dog, and they know that CAT represents cat, and so on for the millions of other words they learn. Concrete operations is about 7 to 11, and in this stage, a child's mental complexity noticeably increases so that their ability to reason increases. And then we get to our focus, formal operations. Usually begins around age 11 and continues to about age 15 to 20, depending on the person. Now, following Piaget's stages of cognitive development, you can see that each one builds on the one before. So it's like a step up, and the formal operation stage is the same. Now, don't get confused by the way this term is used. You might hear me say a person is in the formal operation stage or is at formal operations, meaning it's still developing, or somebody is thinking with formal operations or using formal operations, meaning that they are in fact thinking in a more complex manner. In this stage, a person develops the ability to think in a much more complex manner about things that involve multiple variables. How do we know this? How can we see this? Well, the classic test for this is referred to as the pendulum problem. And all this is it's a kind of like a scientific experiment to see what stage of thinking somebody is at. It's just a problem used to gauge whether a person is in the concrete operation stage or formal operation stage. So the pendulum problem studies how a person would approach the problem. When you read about this in the textbook, what it says is that according to Piaget, the difference between these two stages is that in the formal operation stage, a person's thinking is much more complex. So they think in a more systematic manner, a more scientific manner. They try to hypothesize more. and think ahead more in a way that is just not seen in the stage before. Overall, their approach to the problem is more complex because they're using a more complex thought process. Now, part of what indicates this is that their thinking incorporates that it's important to only change one thing at a time so that they'll know exactly what factor it is that changes the speed of the pendulum. So they take into account cause and effect. In other words, according to Piaget, in the formal operation stage, a person develops hypothetical deductive reasoning, the ability to think in a manner that systematically tests possible solutions, thus arriving at an answer that can be defined and explained. Now, again, this may seem overly simplistic, but think about your science classes in elementary school and junior high school compared to your science classes in grade 12. Remember those science experiments you had to do in junior high, and sometimes it'd have you use Bristol board and set up like a little stand. Just the basic level of thinking and reasoning involved is very different from the hypothetical deductive reasoning typical of someone who is older. But Piaget also recognized that it isn't just scientific thinking that noticeably increases during formal operations. He said that basic logical thinking also changes. And I'm not trying to be funny when I say this, but Piaget really thought a lot about how people learn to think. Specifically, he said that abstract thinking, metacognition, and complex thinking also increase in adolescence during the formal operations stage. Now, these are a lot of terms to be throwing at you at once, so let's take them one by one. Piaget said from age 11 and up, abstract thinking is important. If you think about what the word abstract means, apart from Piaget, if something is abstract, it's not exact. One definition I found said, existing in thought or as an idea, but not having a physical or concrete existence. Friendship is an abstract idea. Love is an abstract idea. In many ways, culture is. I could go on and get very philosophical, but I think these are enough examples. I like that the text uses the example of politics and political discussions, that sometimes people in adolescence will begin to discuss politics, because for me, this is a great example. If you talk to somebody who's 7 or 8 about politics, they usually still see issues in a very black-white, yes-no, just, unjust manner, with no in between at all. And they don't really seem to have the ability to understand that there often is an in-between with social and political issues. They just don't take into account all of the variables involved in a political issue. But once this ability for abstract thought becomes more developed, a person can think about politics and social issues and morality and religion and what is good or bad in a much more complete and complex manner, because they're able to grasp that these are multi-dimensional issues, that often they're not just black and white either or. They've developed the ability to have a better understanding of the abstract ideas involved. And Piaget said that during formal operations, the ability for abstract thinking noticeably increases. Then he also referred to metacognition. He meant the ability to think about thinking, to be aware of how you think, to acknowledge how you think. And in having the ability to recognize how you think and process information, you can then reason and monitor how you process your own information. So metacognition is something else that he said increases with formal operations. A concept that I personally like, and although it does sound very philosophical and kind of hippie-ish, it is in fact something that truly exists. It is a process that people make use of in adolescence as well as the rest of their life. It would be really, really unusual to hear a child reflecting on why they think the way they do, why they think about themselves in a certain way, to consider why they are the way they are in terms of their perceptions and thoughts. It's not impossible, but it would be highly unusual. Usually, it's not until adolescence that a person first develops can't speak today, metacognition in which they can monitor their own thinking processes. When they are aware of their actual process of thinking, and because of this, they consider why they think the way they do about various things. So if somebody is homophobic, they're raised by caregivers who teach them to be homophobic, to think negatively about anyone who is not heterosexual. As a child, they are less likely to question the content of the information they're given, as well as how they personally process it. But as an adolescent, because of the development of metacognition, they are more likely to question themselves about why they think about heterosexuality the way they do. They're more likely to question how they process that information. They're more likely to think to themselves, why do I think that? Why do I think of it in that way? And that is metacognition. Piaget also says that in the formal operation stage, thinking becomes more complex. And when he referred to complex thinking, he meant the ability to take into account multiple connections and interpretations and variables. And he uses the example of metaphors and sarcasm to demonstrate this. A metaphor is a figure of speech where a word or a phrase is applied to an object or action to which it is not literally applicable. So calling somebody a black sheep, the world is a stage, love is a battlefield, Jennifer is a couch potato. So a metaphor is a figure of speech containing an implied comparison. Words or phrases that are ordinarily applied to one thing are applied to something you wouldn't necessarily pair it with. And these can be really difficult for younger children to understand or use because metaphors have more than one meaning. You have to read into them. You have to think about them to get them. As an adult, you may be used to them, accustomed to them, so you realize what they mean. But whether you are aware of it or not, you are thinking on some level to realize that the usual meaning of the word or phrase is not what it is intended in this context. The example in the text of the study looking at the sentence, "One bad apple spoils the whole barrel," and children thinking this sentence is literally speaking about fruit was kind of cute. And it demonstrates this point very well. They think it actually means if there's a rotten apple in a barrel of apples, that will cause all the apples to spoil, which is true. But the metaphor means one bad or negative or unpleasant person in a group can cause the whole group to be that way. Sarcasm is another example of more complex thinking in adolescence in the formal operation stage. Something else that children tend to have a difficult time grasping and understanding. Sarcasm is the use of irony to mock or convey contempt. It can be a sharp, bitter, or cutting expression or remark. It can be a bit more mild. And usually, sarcasm is distinguished by the manner in which it's spoken, by the context within which it is used. Children very rarely use sarcasm in the same way as an adolescent or adult, and they rarely understand sarcasm in the same way as an adolescent or adult. The textbook provides examples of a few studies that demonstrate how sarcasm is more developed. It's more pronounced in adolescence compared to earlier. What stands out most to me is the first example, in which the participants had to determine if something that was said was sincere, deceptive, or sarcastic. And I think this stood out to me because it reminded me of junior high and early high school, trying to figure out what people meant when they were talking, where they were coming from. In a way, this simple sentence really seemed to summarize a lot of the experience of those years. Unfortunately, people in junior high and high school can be very sarcastic to one another. Nice hair, nice makeup. They don't understand how sarcasm works and start to overuse it. And yes, often when speaking to their parents. So far, Jean Piaget and his theory of cognitive development seem to make a lot of sense. Whether you agree with his perspective 100% or not, it does seem to make sense for the most part. And that's probably why he's still cited so often today in textbooks and academic articles in college and university classrooms. As a human being grows up, just like their body develops and goes through certain stages, so does their cognitive ability, their ability to think, how their brain processes information. Their brain matures just like their physical body does. But he and his theory do have critics. And for the most part, criticisms are directed at his stage that is of most relevance for this course, the formal operations stage that occurs during adolescence. And please keep in mind, I'm not here to convince you one way or another regarding Piaget and his theories, or regarding any theory or ideas presented in this course. I feel that my role is to present you with information, assist in clarifying that information so that you can attain the greatest understanding of it possible, and that enables you to make up your own mind. Either you agree with him or you don't. Either you agree with parts of what he says or you don't. Having said that, there are two main criticisms of the formal operations stage. Specifically, that it doesn't take into account differences between people enough, and that it really doesn't acknowledge how culture can affect this stage at all. So looking at the first criticism, as I just highlighted, Piaget said our brain's ability to think advances and matures. And although his ages are not absolutely exact, every person will or should go through the stages he outlines at roughly the ages he outlines, unless there's some kind of problem. So, everybody who is about 4 years old should be at about the same level of cognitive ability or cognitive maturation, just as everybody who is 7 or 10 or 14 and so on. And if we extend this approach a little further in a little more detail, that means that every 4-year-old will approach a problem in generally the same manner using the same processes. And every 7-year-old child will, and 10-year-old, and 14-year-old, and so on. So somebody who is an adolescent in the formal operations stage as identified by Piaget will make use of the same mental processes to solve a problem or figure something out, or to just think about it. No matter what the particular topic is, the process will be the same. The mental structures will be the same. The problem is there is a lot of research that indicates otherwise, that instead, during adolescence, as an adult, there is a whole ton of difference in the process of thinking between people. In other words, just because a person possesses the capabilities that Piaget describes does not mean when they use they're going to use the same capability with every situation, with every context in the same way. Instead, there seems to be quite a bit of difference in how adolescents and adults think about different things. And again, there's a difference in how they think. Our focus is on the thought process, not necessarily what they are thinking. For example, it is strongly argued that a person's education or lack thereof is going to affect what thought processes they use, that it's not just a matter of maturity, as Piaget said. And I want to be clear here. They're not saying that people with less formal education do not think as well as people with more formal education. Not at all. What they're saying is that the amount and kind of education a person has will influence the manner in which they think. And to me, this makes sense. Somebody who has essentially been trained to view information from an academic point of view will in some ways process information differently, while somebody who has more real life experience will probably process information differently. Not better than the other, but differently. And in addition, a lot of research demonstrates that for those people who do use formal operations, they don't use it consistently. Again, it depends on a whole range of variables. And again, I understand this and I try to relate it to a real life example. Do you think completely rationally and logically about every single issue you encounter? Probably not, even though you have the ability to. So you do not consistently use formal operations with everything you encounter. So while Piaget says people who are in or who have completed the formal operation stage will think in a particular way all the time, research indicates this is not true. People do not always think in the same manner all the time. Now, the textbook goes into quite a bit more detail where this is concerned. The examples are all saying the same thing, that whether we're talking about a practical, real problem in real life or about something theoretical, it's not just a matter of maturity that determines how a person thinks. There's more to it. The second main criticism of Piaget in his formal operation stage involves culture, which is a major theme in this course. Well, in traditional cultures that are collectivistic in nature, that do not usually have formal schooling like we do, it's not unusual for there to be no evidence of formal operations developing at all. But, and this is very, very important, there is often no evidence of formal operations occurring when their thinking is measured using modern, typical measurements like the pendulum problem, or other research techniques typical of measuring the prevalence of Piaget's theories, used in individualistic westernized cultures. And when you read about Piaget's response to this in the text, he does acknowledge that maybe the people in these cultures without formal schooling are not being measured in an appropriate manner for them, for their society and culture. For example, it would be silly to take a bubble scan sheet that college and university students are used to using and give that to a tribe in the Amazon to assess them. Instead, we'd figure out some kind of method of testing that fit better with their kind of lifestyle. Clearly, that kind of testing would not fit there. That is essentially what Piaget is saying. So Piaget says, yeah, you can apply my theory to any culture, but you need to be culturally sensitive and realize every kind of testing and research does not fit with every kind of society or culture. So the pendulum problem might not be an accurate reflection of the existence of formal operations for people in every culture. And maybe it's just me, but this makes sense. I don't perceive it as him making an excuse. I think because it seems like common sense. And you never know. Maybe even doing that, researchers would find there's still no evidence of formal operations in some traditional cultures. I don't know. So Piaget's theory has been criticized for not recognizing individual differences, for not taking culture into account, and for the fact that that's it. That according to him, cognitive development is complete and ends at about age 20 when the formal operation stage should be complete. That to him, the formal operation stage is the last stage of cognitive development that continues until about age 20. And after that, your cognitive ability has matured and that's it. You live your life as an adult and think as an adult should without any more significant changes or developments. Just on the surface, I can understand why this is problematic for some observers, because as an adult, you know that overall you continue to change and grow and develop. And yes, you continue to mature. A 20-year-old can be very different from somebody in their 40s, for example. In fact, usually they are much different in how they approach a problem and their perceptions. It sounds a bit hokey, I know, but you do continue to grow in various ways as an adult, emotionally, socially, and yes, even how you think. So why would it make sense that our cognitive abilities do not grow after age 20? You can continue to learn new things. So doesn't it make sense that you can continue to also change the way you think? That the manner in which you arrive at your perceptions might shift a bit too? So Piaget is criticized for stating that, you know what, once formal operations is done, that's it, your brain is fully cooked, so to speak.